how many games can say they've been a Game of the Year contender in 2 separate years? Not only is the original Metroid Prime considered one of the best of the entire GameCube library, Prime Remastered ended up as one of the highest rated games of 2023. It reflects how excellent the essence of this game is, that a remake that doesn't touch the core experience at all can still be considered an elite game on one of Nintendo's most successful consoles. But when you take a closer look at the development of Metroid Prime, you find an absolute horror story confined within the walls of Retro Studios. This is the miracle of Metroid Prime's success. We begin by dialing back the clock about 30 years, to 1994, the release year of Super Metroid. An absolute classic, as I'm sure you know, widely considered to be among the Metroid series' best games, and possibly even the best of them all. At the time, the game received rave reviews as well, although sales were not as high as they possibly could have been, due to the SNES being in its final years. The Nintendo 64 was coming up, and focus was shifting to that console, and while many of Nintendo's biggest franchises would end up making their 3D debuts on it, Metroid never did. According to series director Yoshio Sakamoto, this was the result of him being unable to picture how you could control Samus using the N64 controller. So, an unknown company was approached by Nintendo with the task of creating a Metroid game for N64. However, they also declined, because the company did not feel confident they could make a worthy successor to Super Metroid on Nintendo 64. Years went by, in fact, the entire console generation passed by, because by the time Metroid returned, it would be on the GameCube. For a total of 8 years, Metroid was nowhere to be seen, so you can imagine what the status of the series was when it eventually ended up at its new home. That home was Retro Studios. Retro was founded in 1998 by Jeff Spangenberg, who had the vision of creating an American counterpart to what Rare was over in Britain. During the N64 days, Rare had established themselves as a top-tier second-party developer for Nintendo, responsible for bestsellers like Donkey Kong 64, Banjo-Kazooie, and Conker's Bad Fur Day. Retro wanted to follow that blueprint and, just like Rare, was a second-party developer for Nintendo, who had stakes in the company. This was undoubtedly the result of Spangenberg's resume, which included popular games like Turok 64. The company started as a one-man operation in his own home, but within a year it grew to a size of 25 people and started an office in Austin, Texas. However, despite this promising start, things would soon go south for Retro. They started work on several demos during the first 2 years of their existence, despite not having GameCube development kits. The demos covered a wide range of different genres, including an RPG, an action-adventure game, a sports game, and a first-person shooter. While Retro Studios continued to grow, eventually ending up as big as 200 employees, things were only getting worse and worse. Nintendo executives were not impressed by Retro's creations, and founder Spangenberg was showing his face less and less down in Austin. He was frequently absent, delegated his responsibilities away, and barely supervised anything. Rumors at the time even suggested he was stealing money from the company, but I couldn't find any substantial proof for that claim. This entire mess prompted Shigeru Miyamoto to fly down from Japan and pay Retro a visit. He took a look at the games they were working on and was impressed by a third-person shooter, at the time known as Metaforce. The game had a science fiction setting and featured a female protagonist, reminding Miyamoto of a certain bounty hunter. So he suggested they make it a Metroid game instead, and what Miyamoto says goes. His suggestion of using one of their established franchises may indicate he saw a lot of potential in the company, but it was more the other way around. Nintendo didn't have a ton of faith in Metroid anymore, and frankly didn't really care if it bombed or failed. But for Retro, this was one hell of an opportunity. Mind you, they hadn't even made a single game at this point in time yet. The other demos Retro was working on were slowly cancelled over time, with all resources going to what would eventually become Metroid Prime. But that didn't mean everything was suddenly rainbow and sunshines. More the opposite, in fact. The cancellation of the other games led to several employees being laid off, until there were only 9 people working on Prime. It didn't take long for this smaller Retro to fall behind schedule, and the complete mismanagement of Spangenberg culminated when pictures surfaced on Retro servers of him accompanied by several naked women inside a bathtub. Not long after, Nintendo bought Spangenberg's stakes in the company, showing him the door and making Retro Studios fully owned by Nintendo, without having released even a single game. This entire ordeal happened in the middle of Metroid Prime's development. For the first 3 months of the game's development, the team was in constant contact with several Nintendo veterans, causing the perspective of the game to transition from third person to first person. This was Miyamoto's idea, based on feedback that it made the game feel unintuitive and hindered the exploration. It meant several sections that had been worked on for months had to be scrapped. It caused a huge rift between the developers, with Sakamoto and Spangenberg being firm in their opinion the game should have a third-person perspective. Camp Miyamoto ended up winning, however, although it did cause the resignation of lead developer John Whitmore. While he didn't agree with Miyamoto at the time, he did come around a decade later and said he made the right choice. The control scheme was also heavily altered. Originally, it was the same control scheme as we now know from shooters, as well as Prime Remastered, using dual sticks. However, this was changed as a direct result of Retro lacking GameCube development kits, leading to them overestimating the power of the console and finding the control scheme to not work. In total, Retro needed a full 6 months to design the first level that got Nintendo's approval, with only 9 months remaining for the rest of the game. It started a grueling period for the team, now consisting of 25 people, who worked almost every day of the week for 12 hours a day. It is the kind of crunch that we have come to associate with horror stories of failed games and studios going under, but Metroid Prime would not end up following that path. Right? Well, at the time, that was not the consensus. While Retro was working overtime to get the game finished, Prime was revealed at E3 2001. Samus had originally been a part of Space World 2000 a year prior, where the GameCube was officially unveiled to great reception from the audience. Metroid was back after a long hiatus and everyone was excited. But that sentiment shifted after seeing Prime. This wasn't a 2D side-scroller people had come to love. This was a 3D shooter, which at the time felt like Nintendo was chasing trends instead of giving Metroid fans what they wanted. People thought this was Nintendo's attempt to follow the waves of Quake or Halo, who had seen immense success with this game style in the years prior. To put it mildly, Prime was not getting the support from fans that could help motivate the team. And Nintendo seemed to agree. In-house, they began work on Metroid Fusion, a GBA game that followed the familiar Metroid formula and ended up releasing 1 day before Prime in the US. It feels unthinkable now, right? Imagine we got Prime 4 the day after Dread. It's insane. Anyway, this was Metroid 4, and hype behind the game shot through the roof after it was revealed at E3 2002, with IGN dubbing it one of the best games at E3. Prime may have been revealed earlier, but it was Fusion that got fans excited that Metroid was back after a long hiatus. It was quite the opponent for the Prime team to be up against, developed by the same legendary figures back in Japan who they were having weekly correspondence with. Meanwhile, Retro's deadline was coming ever closer. Miyamoto flew in again and personally improved the controls, while friends and family were brought in as playtesters. There simply weren't the resources or time for professionals to do that work. Concept artist Android Jones, responsible for the design of Samus's suits and the visors, would sleep in the office and go to work as soon as he woke up. Retro became a revolving door, with employees constantly going in and out as a result of the intense crunch during this period. The game finally went gold in October 2002, but this still didn't mean the end of Retro's work on the game. Nintendo informed them the sole GameCube development kit they had was defective, leading to Prime not working on several batches of released GameCubes. Of course, this had to be fixed, and fortunately, this was done in time for release in November. The tide for the game had changed by now, at least with general audiences, as Prime ended up outselling Fusion pretty heavily and became the second best-selling game of the month. This was partly due to word of mouth, with Prime receiving great reviews, but it was also simply the result of a console first-person shooter going up against a handheld side-scroller. Fusion clearly marketed itself towards existing fans of the series, while Prime tapped into new audiences. Even though Metroid fans at the time kept preferring Fusion over Prime, like they had during the initial hype cycle, Samus, her first 3D adventure, ended up becoming one hell of a victory lap for Retro. Not only is the game still considered one of the GameCube's best all these years later, it was also the best-selling game in the Metroid franchise for nearly 20 years, until Metroid Dread eventually ended up beating it. It brought what we now call Metroidvania to a 3D plane in a fantastic way, nailing it on the first try really. Fans at the time didn't see it, but the way Prime translates Metroid's gameplay formula to what is essentially a first-person shooter or adventure game is incredible. Steve Barcia, who had replaced Spangenberg as president of Retro following his departure, had done an amazing job of steadying the ship, and to this day is largely credited for the success of Prime. He left the company not long after to join EA. His replacement was Michael Kelbaugh, who was brought in from up at Nintendo to continue the Prime series. He's still Retro's president today, overseeing work on Prime 4, which might at this point have a development story not too dissimilar from the original. Fortunately, the working environment at Retro today is said to be miles better than it was back then, so I don't expect Prime 4 developers to be sleeping in the office like their colleagues 20 years ago. And what better than that illustrates the absolute miracle Prime ended up being. From complete mismanagement to intense crunch and a Nintendo-made competitor releasing a day earlier, Prime beat all odds. Like a beautiful flower grown from the wasteland that was Retro at the time, it became Metroid's biggest success and arguably his best game too. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed hearing me talk about Metroid, please consider liking this video and subscribing. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.